What's going on YouTube? My name is Dom and today I'm bringing you a Rogue Company beginner strategy guide. But even though this video is tailored for Rogue Company, I use the language of that game. You don't have to implement it just in that game. This is applicable everywhere, and in fact I'm going to be using ancient military tactics to actually demonstrate how strategy ought to work in a game like this. So this can really work for any game that doesn't have respawns. Now I know there is a game mode in here that does have respawns, however they are limited, so it's a little bit more strategic in that way. Respawns kind of throw the whole strategy game off a little bit, and you have to adopt some half-ass strategies. The tactic I'm going to be going over today is a very simple tactic. It's called the hammer and anvil strategy. Now this is an ancient military strategy developed by Alexander the Great. Just a little bit of a background on that. That's when it really came into use because armies started to use cavalry, and the benefit of using cavalry was before, when you'd have foot soldiers basically just fucking that was loud. But basically when you'd have foot soldiers just fucking collide, it was might. You know, it was just a pure duking it out boxing match basically. And when you had cavalry, you would stack up cavalry on one side, and then they would be able to come around the backside and hit your enemy in the back. So therefore you were hitting them from the front with your infantry and from the back with your cavalry. Thus the hammer and anvil strategy. That's what it's meant to do. This has been used in a ton of ancient battles, and it's still a tactic used today. Whenever you hear somebody in the game, or pretty much any game, when you hear somebody say, I'm going to hit the flank, or I'm going to try to hit him from behind, they're using a hammer and anvil strategy. However, there's a lot of nuance to it, a lot of subtlety that people just don't get. So I wanted to go over it today to iron out all the details so you know exactly how to use it. First of all, the reason this strategy is so important and it's so useful and it's very good at taking down an enemy is because it does it does two major things. It cuts off the enemy's ability to retreat, and it also forces them to fight on two sides, and that's not a good spot to be in. So to begin with, this strategy really requires cohesiveness to work together. You can't have too many independent parts that aren't playing their role. You have to kind of all be one unit, and you have to move together, and you have to understand what each player on your team is trying to accomplish. But let's start with the anvil portion of this strategy. Now the anvil in this scenario is going to be your front line, basically the thing that's going to hold the enemy back, while your hammer can come around the side and hit them from the behind or from the side. Now the anvil's goal is basically to run headlong into the enemy and not fucking die. You basically stand there, you don't retreat, you don't turn tail, and run. Now for the anvil, for forming that portion of the team, a few characters come to mind, you know, namely like Anvil. The guy is named Anvil. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think the people who made this game knew what they were talking about when they said Anvil. But you could also throw in people like Vi, Dallas, Dima, or really anybody that can keep people back with. But remember, you know, anybody who has gear and perks that they can stack, maybe armor perks, reduced damage from explosives, things like that that make those characters really hardy. Even Chalk, because Chalk has a self-res, you can throw those people in there just to hold the enemy back. Now these people, you do not want to go down, you do not want to turn tail and run. You basically want to keep the front line busy in this sense. You don't want to take too much damage, you definitely don't want to go down, and you don't want to kill anybody either. You just want to keep them busy, keep them occupied, and poke some holes in the front line while your guys can come around the side. Now usually you'd have two people on the anvil, sometimes three. I think two's a little bit better because you want your hammer to be hard hitting. So two people for anvil. Don't engage, be disciplined, don't run. And what's super important when thinking about being the anvil is that you're going to be outgunned most of the time. If you're going to be running up against a four-man squad and they're running tight, it's mostly going to be 2v4 for that battle, for that first part of it. So choose your position wisely. We could go into so much depth here of where to place your anvil, where to place your front line. But you mainly want to think about choke points, good elevation points, places where you can't be outflanked very easily, and places where you could throw down anvil, shield, and other gear that will help you keep the enemy back. Basically, whatever point you want to contest, make sure it's a point that you can control with two people. Think of 300. If you guys have seen the movie 300, that's a perfect example of a choke point. Now the hammer portion of this attack is arguably the most important part, and it's personally my favorite part to talk about because there's so many different ways you could do it. But basically the hammer requires speed, timing, and patience. Now you would think speed and patience are kind of polar opposites, but they're actually very closely related. You need to be patient, but when you decide to strike, that's the timing, and you need to do it quickly. So for these, I was thinking of characters like Lancer, Ronin, Talon, even Chalk. Chalk's a good versatile character. Even Vi as well. Anything that you can do fast. You want to be deceptive. You want to be subtle. You do not want to be found on these flanks, because let's say your Anvil is holding back 4 people and you are coming around the flank, and you get found out by, you get revealed by Dallas or by Talon or something like that. Your flank is pretty much screwed. They can turn and they can angle towards you, which is exactly what, if you guys are at all familiar with historical battles, Alexander the Great did at the Battle of Guatemala. He was hit with a hammer and anvil strategy himself. He angled his troops on the side to defend from that hammer, and you do not want that to happen to you. So you need to be subtle, but you also need to be quick. When you're being the hammer, it's best not to get carried away and flank immediately. Remember, this requires timing, so it's probably best to follow your Anvil characters first, stay behind them. Don't get engaged in the enemy, because you don't want to go down either. You can take some pokes here and there, but don't open up to too much risk. Wait to be pushed, and then when you have the right opportunity, then you go for the flank. Once an enemy opponent goes down, maybe you do a lot of damage to them, or you're just holding them really nicely and they're in a disadvantaged position, you're gonna want to pull off that flank pretty quick. But keep in mind, again, things like elevation. When doing this strategy, you got to make sure you're not going to be fighting an uphill battle on that flank, because even if you take that enemy by surprise, it could still bite you in the ass. If you're shooting up a hill or you're open, you don't have any cover options. Keep these things in mind. Also, save your abilities, save your lethals, save your hard-hitting shit for when you get behind them. The artillery, if you're Dima, you want to save your cluster grenade until you get freaking right behind him. You see all of them, and then you just unleash. You want to hit these people hard. You don't want to give them any time to breathe. You want to hit them hard and fast, because the longer you give somebody to think about a situation, the more likely they are to outsmart you or outmaneuver you. You want to give them no time to think. Now, of course, when talking about any strategy, it's always important to talk about how you lose. First of all, if your Anvil is not strong enough and they don't do their job well enough and they get steamrolled, that's obviously, you're going to fail there, because you probably have 1 or 2 teammates down, and your hammer's not going to be able to hit hard, because you're opening up the areas that the enemy team can now maneuver in. You want to limit their mobility, not increase it. If your Anvil goes down, you're increasing their mobility, not decreasing it. The second biggest reason you're going to lose is if you get lured into gunfights that you just shouldn't be getting into in the first place. This is the #1 pet peeve of mine. This is the #1 reason I see this strategy fail all the time. When I was playing a Ghost Recon competitively, this is the #1 thing. You get an overzealous teammate who goes in, wants to get in gunfights, and gets fucking killed. Thirdly, if the enemy anticipates your flank, that can really be a pain in the ass. So keep this in mind. I think that I stressed this point enough, but that's why subversion and deception are the best strategies for flanking. Fourthly, and this is something a lot of people don't necessarily think about, if your hammer gets out-hammered, and what that means is, if you are trying to flank and you are trying to be the hammer that's coming in, and they are also sending a flanking team. Remember, this is a very common strategy. It's just a lot of people don't pull it off well, and they don't do it good enough. If they come around and maybe you pulled your flank too wide, or you pulled it too narrow, and then the enemy can go around you, or they can go in between you and your Anvil, you don't want that to happen. You want to have a well enough flank so that you're still close enough to your team to limit options, but still can see if someone is outflanking you. You want to pay attention to these things. Don't get out hammered, and send 2 people on your hammer just in case there is someone flanking or 2 people flanking. You're gonna do okay. Fifthly, if your team is unobservant, that's a good way to lose. Now, what I mean by this is, if your Anvil sets up, it gets into initial combat, you need to make sure you know where the enemies are. Are there 1, 2, 3, or 4 people right in front of your Anvil? What if there were 4, but now there's only 1? People disappeared. What happened to them? Where did they go? You have to be observant. Also be observant to things like elevation and gadgets that are on the ground. So be observant. Are you in an advantageous position? If you advance, will you become disadvantaged? Are they possibly flanking you currently? Think about these things. And also keep in mind that the enemy isn't always going to meet you head on. That's not going to happen probably 90% of the time. So let's say you're moving, you find maybe 1 or 2 players, but the other ones are unaccounted for. You can shift your position. You can shift your Anvil at any time so that your front line is facing the majority of wherever those people are at. And this leads me up to my sixth and final point about how to lose, is you have to be adaptive. And don't get stuck into a rigid formula of we're going to fight here, and then my flank is going to come in this way or that way, and that's going to be the end of it. You have to be adaptive. This means if you have your anvil, sometimes you can do a double flank. Sometimes there's an opening down the middle to get your hammer in. We can go ahead and scratch that one from the tape. But you understand what I mean if you get your mind out of the gutter. So be adaptive. And basically what I'm saying here, if you want to go the Eastern philosophical route, just ignore everything I just said. Don't come in with a strict mindset. Don't come in trying to pull this shit off. Just be aware of it and let it happen naturally. That's the way you want these things to happen. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. This is just a beginner strategy guide, a general strategy guide. There's like 7 maps in this game currently, and we can honestly do an in-depth breakdown on every single map just with this strategy and what routes are applicable to, what are the best choke points and things like that. But that's way too much for one video, possibly in future videos. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Don't fucking push me.